Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Leslie Kendrick, and I'm the dean here at the law school. First off, I want to thank everyone at the law school and the Law School Foundation who's made this event possible, including Kathy Bowes from the Law School Foundation, everyone on the law school's IT team, communications, and building services team. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for coming. I'm delighted to welcome you and to welcome one of our own, David Baldacci, class of 1986. David has been writing since childhood when his mother gave him a lined notebook in which to write down his stories. David published his first novel, Absolute Power, in 1996. The feature film adaptation of that novel followed with Clint Eastwood as its director and star. In total, David has published 50 novels for adults. All have been national and international bestsellers. Several have been adapted for film and television. They've been published in over 45 languages and in more than 80 countries, with 150 million copies sold worldwide. David has also published 7 novels for young readers. A lifelong Virginian, David received his bachelor's degree from Virginia Commonwealth University and his law degree here at UVA, after which he practiced law for about a decade at Holland & Knight in Washington, D.C. In addition to being a prolific writer, David is a devoted philanthropist, and his greatest efforts are dedicated to his family's Wish You Well Foundation. Established by David and his wife, Michelle, the Wish You Well Foundation supports family and adult literacy programs in the United States. Here at the law school, we are honored that David has just made a $1.5 million gift to support scholarships, a public service summer fellowship, and a public service loan forgiveness fund. I have to say on a personal note that I am particularly honored to welcome David back in my first year as dean, as he was my graduation speaker when I graduated from the law school in 2006. David, we are delighted to have you today, and I'll turn it over to you to talk about your newest book, Calamity of Souls.
Well, you know you're getting old when you gave the commencement speech for the dean of the law school. And when I was walking down the hallway today, I started out, when I was in law school, I called it the one-quarter law school. We just had that little building over there, and that was it for us. All this stuff came later. But I was walking down the hall, and I saw and you know you're getting old when all your law school professors' portraits are on the wall, you know, and they look sort of faded and a little dusty, but life goes on, right? It's great to be back here. I think the last time I was at the law school was maybe for my 30th law school reunion. Which was a great event, and it was great to catch up with old classmates. You know, I've been a published writer for almost 30 years now, and I tour widely in this country and all over the world. And when I'm on a book tour, I get a lot of questions from people. And one of the ones they ask most of all is, what is it like to be a #1 best-selling writer? And I know the way they ask the question, they want some sort of like this Hollywood glitzy answer of like, I get up at noon every day, and I put on a smoking jacket, and I have a little dog that I carry under my arm, and I go down to my study where I have a bevy of people to write down my every brilliant utterance, which is not the case. You know, just ask my wife. I go to a cool event, and I come home, I'm telling her about it, she stops me halfway through. Yeah, it's trash night, get on it. Now, I have only written about strong, independent women in all of my novels for one reason. That's all I've ever been exposed to my whole life. I've never met a damsel in distress in my life. It's just not what I wired for. And it's very important for me, and particularly in a book like Calamity of Souls, I tried to take on 2 things in that novel, racism and sexism. They're the 2 terrible scourges of our country's history. But when I'm on tour, you know, and I get that question, what is it like to be a best-selling novelist? I always tell this story. My kids are all grown and gone, you know, off on their own now, but when they were little, it was very difficult for me to explain to them what I did for a living. You know, how do you tell a 3-year-old that dad writes books for a living? I remember when I first started out, I'd sold my first novel, and we had this cleaning crew that would come in once a week at our old townhouse in Alexandria, and they were a great crew, but all of a sudden I was there every day in a ball cap and sweatpants, you know, instead of being at work at the law firm. And after like a month of this, them coming every week, finally the foreman came over with a ball cap filled with money. And he said, we made a collection for you. You've obviously lost your job, and we just wanted you to have this money. And, I mean, I was so touched by it. I mean, I kept the cash. But anyway, no, I didn't keep the cash. And then I heard my daughter later telling a playmate, you know, I think we're going to have to sell our house because Daddy doesn't work anymore, because she just saw Dad at home with a ball cap. So in answer to that question, I tell them a story about my kids. When my daughter was about 5, I took her to one of my book signings because I wanted her to see, okay, here's Dad signing books. So we went to the bookstore, and the woman who owned it introduced herself and said, do you know why all these people are here? And my daughter said, yes, I do know. Why are they here? They want my dad to sign their book. Why is that? She goes, it's obvious. My daddy has the nicest handwriting. I think she's 31 now, and I think she still believes that. So, when my son was 2 or 3 years old, I just took him to a bookstore to buy a book. Nothing to do with me as a writer. And my son has always been that kid of like, how can I make a lot of money fast? You know, he's 28 now, and that's still sort of where he is in life. And we went into the bookstore, and he saw all the people reading all the books, all the cash being exchanged at the cash register. And all of a sudden, my 2-year-old took off running at the top of the speed across the bookstore, screaming at the top of his lungs, my daddy will sign any book you've got for $2. And he will take the $2, of course. I wouldn't get a penny of it. Now, I travel a lot, and I fly a lot, and strange things sometimes happen when you do that. I was on a plane one time, and I'm just sitting there minding my own business, and the pilot comes out of the cockpit, and he calls the flight attendant over, and they're having this conversation. And then she goes and gets a bunch of papers, and they're looking through, I don't know what it was, maybe the manifest, and they keep looking over at me. And to the extent that I was getting a little nervous about this. And then the flight attendant took the sheaf of papers and walked quickly down the aisle and past me. And the pilot came over and sat down next to me, and looking worried, which you never want to be on a plane with a pilot is looking worried, right? And he's sitting next to me, and I'm just sort of staring at him, and he said, can I ask you a question? And I said, absolutely, but can I text my wife? Because if we're going down, I'd just like to say goodbye. He goes, oh, no, the plane's fine. The plane's fine, no problem. I said, okay, what's your question? He said, I got a great idea for a thriller. Do you want to hear it? I have a vivid imagination. I did not see that one coming, actually. And I don't know about all of you, but I generally like to have 2 pilots flying every plane that I'm on. So I made a deal with him. I said, you know, if you get back up in the cockpit with your buddy and you land safely, I will stay behind and listen to your idea. And he's like, awesome, thank you. So he gets back up in the cockpit, we land, everybody deplanes except me. He comes back, he sits down, he's so excited. He is giddy with enthusiasm about his story. And he tells me the story, and to put it politely, it sucked. There was nothing redeeming about this idea at all. There was nothing I could do with it. But he was just so happy. And I didn't want to, like, trash his enthusiasm, so I said, and I'm thinking, how can I say this in a way that would be sort of positive? And I said, you know what? Do you know what? I think that you're doing with your life exactly what you were intended to do. Not everybody can fly a plane. I can't fly a plane, and I have to tell you that landing, it's the best I've ever had. I never felt anything when we touched down. On the other hand, not everyone is cut out to be a writer. And I think that other things being equal, you may very well fall in that camp. Now, I could tell by his expression that he was not liking this at all. So I just grabbed my bag and I ran like hell. I'm like, off the plane, I'm gone. And this has been like 15 years ago, so I just landed back from Florida a few days ago. Every time I get on a plane and the cockpit door is open, I do a little peek inside. And if it's him, I'm not getting on the plane. You know, this is not going to happen. I also get, over the years and way back when, you get actually fan mail. You know, people will write you letters. Today it's all emails or postings and all that other stuff that I don't completely understand, but I guess it's critically important for everything. So I got a fan mail letter one time years ago in the late 90s, and I call it fan mail. It wasn't really fan mail. When I opened it up, it was addressed to Dear Mr. Disgusting. And she was taking me to task for my first novel, Absolute Power. And she said, I can't believe that you took a national scandal in this country and wrote about it for money. You repulse me. And she went on, and I was reading it, I understood that she thought I had based Absolute Power. Absolute Power is my first novel. It's about a president of the United States who is a narcissistic sociopath. And he does terrible things while he's in office. And he wants to hold on to power for as long as he can. But a scandal happens that threatens his power. She thought that I had based the novel on the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal. So I thought, well, I can fix this quite easily. So I wrote it back and I said, if you look at the copyright page of Absolute Power, it was published in January of 1996. I wrote the book between 1990 and 1993. I sold it in 1994. The Monica Lewinsky event happened in 1998. So therefore, I could not have written a book about a scandal that happened after I wrote the book and it was published. Sincerely, not Mr. Disgusting. And I thought that would have done it. No. 2 weeks later, I got a letter back from her. And I knew that my argument had not carried the day, as craftily as it was put together, because it was addressed to Dear, Still, Mr. Disgusting. And it was only one sentence in the entire letter. All it said was, that proves nothing. So if you think we've only recently inhabited the world of alternative facts, I can tell you we've been there for a long time. I've had like half a dozen film projects done, TV and movies. I've got, after COVID, sort of the dam burst, so I've sold 5 projects in the last 2 years, 2 at Amazon, 1 at Netflix, 1 at NBC, and 1 at Apple. But I have to say that I've also had a dozen other options that never got made. I'd sold a miniseries to CBS a long time ago, and that was in development for so long that the executive that was assigned to it was fired, hired, fired, hired, fired, and hired again. And then CBS decided they didn't want to do it. So you could make a great living in Hollywood producing stuff and never actually having anything made at all. Never having anything on the screen at all. Now, if that floats your boat, I would suggest maybe go out there and give it a try. But other things being equal, I would not want to have as a career ambition to be a Hollywood producer, because it's like one of those things. It's like a plane crash. You know, 1,000 things have to go wrong in a linear fashion for a plane to go down. In Hollywood, 1,000 things have to go right for actually anything to get done. You can get 100 yeses and 1 no, and the whole project is doomed from the start. Now, I went to VCU undergrad for a couple of reasons. 1, it was in my hometown. 2, my brother and sister had gone there. My sister for journalism, my brother for School of the Arts. And 3, it was cheap. You know, the old adage was if you had money and you lived in Richmond, you went to U of R. If you lived in Richmond, you had no money, you went to VCU. And this was back when sort of VCU was still a commuter school. So I lived at home and I worked full-time all 4 years, and I got out of college with no debt. And I took a gap year. I'd taken the LSATs and I got into UVA law, and I asked for a year deferment so I could, I'd never met a lawyer my whole life. You know, I lived in a neighborhood where there were no lawyers, so I didn't know what lawyers did. So I worked at a law firm in Richmond for a year, and at the end of the year, I didn't hate it, and all the lawyers looked reasonably well fed, you know, so I thought, well, let me just head on to UVA and see what I can do. And then I found out that you couldn't work at UVA while you were going to law school, I guess the first year. So I was like, what the hell do I do, you know? I had to take out a loan, and for an astronomical sum of money. For the 3 years at UVA, I had to take out a loan for $15,000. I know. But back then, that was like, there's no way in the world I could ever possibly pay this much money back. And I remember my second year, when everybody's scrambling around, working your butt off, and having to interview with all the firms. I always thought I was going to practice in Richmond, Virginia, because that was my hometown. So I interviewed with a lot of mainline Richmond firms. And I had an interview package set up, so I went down to Richmond, and I was interviewing with a bunch of lawyers at different firms. And growing up in Richmond with a very ethnic last name that nobody could pronounce, I was sort of this observer. I was like Harriet the Spy. When I was here in law school, I would sit out in the hallways and just watch people, eavesdrop on their conversations. People fascinated me. Because as a writer, you have to be one thing. You have to be curious about everything, not self-absorbed. You have to be, what's out there? I know everything there is to know about me. I know nothing about what's going on out there. I need to learn that and find out about it. So I went down to Richmond. I remember going into this law office as the big partner, you know, the suit, the bow tie, the whole 9 yards. And I looked at my card, and his name was Robert E. Lee IV. And I remember sitting down across from him, and he said, so he had no idea, he couldn't pronounce my last name. I think he called me David. And he said, so David, why do you want to come to this firm? And I remember just staring at him and thinking to myself, I really don't. I just really don't. So this other firm came to UVA, and they were from Washington, D.C. And the only reason I interviewed with them was because of the address of their office. And I was like, that is beyond cool. So I went and interviewed. I got, they said, come to the office, and we'll interview you there, and we'll walk you around, and then maybe you'll get an offer. And I've still got my business card, David Baldacci, Esquire, Watergate office building. They were in the Watergate office building. That was beyond fast. I know a lot of people here, you may not know what Watergate is. For me, it was sort of exciting. So my third year in law school, again, I didn't have a whole lot of money. So what I did, I got all my classes set up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I went from 9 to 5, 3 days a week. Thursday, Friday, I was free, and I went to Washington, D.C., because the firm had given me a permanent offer. So I worked for them during my third year for 2 days a week, which was incredible. So I sort of got a head start on what I could do. The lawyers I worked with, the motions that I was writing motions and during my third year. And to let you know the importance of words, I was assigned one brief to write. We had a client who was a plaintiff in a lawsuit, and they were suing a company. And our client was based in Texas, and the client was based in another state. They had done some business in Texas, and our client was suing them under the long-arm jurisdiction. And the other company was saying, we don't have any ties to Texas. If you want to sue us, you got to come to Connecticut or wherever they were. Okay? So I was assigned to write the motion in support of a brief in support of our motion to, impose long-arm jurisdiction. And I remember sitting there thinking, because when you write a brief, it's not just putting words together. You have to think about how the person is reading this. How are they going to react to what you're saying, to the argument you're trying to make? And the words are important. I remember agonizing for the longest time over the verb that I wanted to use for this motion, the key verb that I wanted to use for the motion. So I wrote, the defendant should not be allowed to come flit in and out of the great state of Texas, reaping all of the benefits but absorbing none of the responsibilities or obligations. That is wrong. That's an injustice. So the brief was filed, and the order came down like 3 weeks later, and the partner I was working on it with came into my little cubbyhole office that they'd given me. I think it used to be a broom closet. I think it still was a broom closet, actually. I think there were brooms behind me, but she said, read it. So it was a one-page order. I read it, and the judge wrote, we cannot allow defendants to flit in and outside the great state of Texas, And I knew words had mattered before that, but that really drove the point home of how one word can make a difference in all the things that you do. So I graduated. I went to D.C. Starting salaries for first-year associates for mainline firms in D.C. You're not going to believe this. Wait for it. $42,000 a year. So I was officially rich, And I went to D.C., and I realized I was still officially poor, because even at that amount of money, it was a high cost of living. So I worked at a firm. I moved to Holland and Knight later on in my career, but I was at a small boutique firm that had national practices all over the country. So I litigated cases all over the country, and I was in court within 1 month of joining the practice. There was no downtime. There was no in the library, figure it out, basically, sort of thing. So I went all over the country and loved it. My first case in federal court was in Alexandria, Virginia, the Rocket Docket. And they call it the Rocket Docket because the judges there used to claim they could have done the O.J. Simpson case in 2 days, not in 1 year. And you couldn't get a continuance in the Rocket Docket even if you had died. They would have expected you to show up as a ghost and actually argue the motion. So it used to be on Washington Street in Old Town. Now it's the bankruptcy court. It was a federal courthouse, the Albert V. Bryan Jr. Federal Courthouse. Okay. My first time in the federal court, I was been out of law school 6 months. I was arguing a motion. So I go to the courtroom where I'm going to argue the motion. And on the wall is this enormous 10 by 10 portrait of Albert V. Bryan Jr. And on the bench is this very old man, sort of shrunken and frail on this huge court, federal bench. And that is Albert V. Bryan III, his son. And I remember looking up at him, and the lawyer on the other side was also a young lawyer, and Brian was sitting in this chair, leaning to the side, his eyes were closed, and he was sort of like drooping. And I looked at the other lawyer, and he kind of looked at me, and I sort of whispered, "Has he had a stroke? Should we call an ambulance?" And he said, "I don't know. It looks weird, doesn't it?" And then Brian just came to life. And I later learned from other lawyers with more experience, he always sat like that. He had a legal pad on his chair. He was writing down everything that was happening in the court. And woe be to you if you made a mistake or spoke out of turn or weren't prepared or didn't have the right case in front of you. He would annihilate you. And I look back on that as some of the greatest experience I ever had as a trial lawyer. But I also understood that you can prepare to the nth degree for everything. And you will go into a courtroom or a business deal, and you will realize that you know maybe half of what you actually need to know, and the surprises are going to come fast and furious. And you need to be able to think on your feet and come up with stuff that you didn't even realize you needed to have 3 seconds before. And this law school prepared me for that. My first year law exam was Professor Bergen, it was property, and we had spent most of the year on, English common law, the fox running through the fields, I love that fox. It was this beautiful fox. So months and months and months, we were grilled in the English common law. And then we spent like 3 days on the UCC, the Uniform Commercial Code. And this is before computers and spreadsheets. The Uniform Commercial Code, here's how I studied for it. I had 14 pieces of printer paper, and I taped them together, and I wrote out in hand how every single article of the commercial code flowed to the other one and all the way down through the paper. And I would go to the library and I would unroll it all across the library, and my classmates would all gather around it and figure out how the UCC really worked together, all the different articles. But we didn't spend a lot of time in property first year with Bergen on the UCC. The entire first year exam was one question. It only had to do with the Uniform Commercial Code. He was a big Red Sox fan, and the exam question opened with a batter at the plate. He knocks the ball out of the park, into the parking lot, where some intrepid person runs over and grabs the ball and runs off with it, and the ball then changes hands like 11 different times, and at the end of the exam, you have to tell him who had lawful ownership of that baseball, according to the Uniform Commercial Code. And we were all pissed beyond belief. And we let him know it after the exam was over. And then Tom Bergen gave all of us a life lesson I've never forgotten. He said, "Look, life is full of surprises. And just because I focus on English common law and give you a little bit of the UCC, it was your responsibility, your duty, your obligation to learn it all and know it all. Because that's what you're going to have to do when you're a lawyer in court. You think this is tough? Wait till you get out there." And the guy was right. Absolutely right. Because I remember this has been 1983, so I learned that lesson, and I remembered that lesson. So now my daughter has gone back to law school. She has worked and traveled all over the world, all in the not-for-profit sector. She never applied to Virginia school because that's where Dad went. She never wanted to be a lawyer because that's what Dad was. And then she worked at the border for about 8 months helping asylum seekers gain access to the United States. She has special language skills that help down there. She called me up one day and said, "Would you support me going back to law school? Because with a law degree, I worked a lot with the ACLU. I see what they can accomplish in court that I can't do. I don't have a law degree. I could help the marginalized communities that I'm really dedicated to if I have a law degree. Would you support me going back to law school?" I said, "Absolutely. I think that would be terrific." I didn't really know if she's a really smart person. I didn't know if she had the focus and discipline that is required for a curriculum like this, and she blew my expectations away. And she's in her third year. She's the editor of the Law Forum. She's already got a full-time job. She's going to be working on immigration, affordable housing, all the stuff that she really cares about. But the cool thing was that she would always call her mom about stuff that was important. But then I'd get a call, and she'd say, "Hey, Dad, you got a few minutes to talk about con law? Because I'm just lost." And I was like, "Absolutely. I would love to talk to you about con law. Please do not ask me any questions about income taxation because I am clueless about that stuff." And my point is, you can do anything with a law degree. A law degree is not just about taking a piece of paper and passing the bar and then going into a room and arguing cases or closing deals. A law degree is about solving problems. I never had a client who came to me when they were super happy. They came to me when they had problems to solve. And that's what law teaches you to think. And there are lots of problems out there, both in the public sector, the private sector, all around the world, certainly in this country. We've got a lot of stuff going on in this country. And being a lawyer, you can be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So for me, I carry with me a lot of the skills that I use on a day-to-day basis that I learned here. And I have to say that some of the best fiction I ever wrote was when I was a lawyer. Because as a trial lawyer, I had the same set of facts as the other side. I couldn't deviate from that. So how did I tell a diametrically opposed version of the truth? Well, I told it through the only arrows that I had in my quiver. I told it through words. I would embellish parts that would help my cause, and I would try to push down facts and things that did not help my cause. I told a story. Whether I was appearing before a judge or a jury, I told a story. And I had to convince them that my version of reality was the right one. And you do that through the words you choose and the passion you bring to those words. And I learned all of that pretty much here. The only arrows in my quiver were words. The only arrow in your quiver going out into the world will be words. They're the most powerful weapons in the world. Forget about nuclear weapons. Words are the most powerful weapons in the world. But they're also weapons for good, positive change as well. Books have changed the world. People have read books that have changed the way we all live. And the creators of those books have moved mountains, if you think about it. After I left the practice of law after 10 years and became a published writer, it was kind of like, the upside down world in Stranger Things. When you're sitting in an event and you have Sandra Day O'Connor sitting next to you and she leans over and says, "I loved your last book. I loved your last book." Now, I grew up in the Jim Crow era in the old capital of the Confederacy in Richmond. My world was totally segregated. I still remember the colored women bathrooms and the white lady restrooms. I never met a black person until I went to high school and played sports with them because it was not allowed. So passing by those statues every day on Monument Avenue as an 8-year-old kid and seeing Robert E. Lee, 60-foot tall bronze statue, Jeb Stuart, Stuart Circle, his plaque said he died for his country. As an 8-year-old, I believed all of that because there was no context to those statues. Nobody was telling me that if you put up a 60-foot tall statue of someone, they must be a great man, right? As a political science student at VCU, I passed by those same monuments as a 20-year-old, and I looked at Jeb Stuart's plaque, and I wondered what country it was that he had died for. Because it certainly wasn't this country. Mark Twain, I'm on the board of the Mark Twain House, and my wife and I started the Mark Twain Literary Prize about 8 years ago. Twain was the most well-traveled person of his generation. He traveled the world multiple times when you could only do it by train and boat. He was the most quoted person of his generation. And one of his most famous quotes was that travel is fatal to prejudice. Well, I grew up in Richmond with no opportunity to travel. I'd never left Richmond I'd never left Richmond while I was a kid. But I traveled the world through books without a plane ticket or a passport. Why do people fear other people? It's because ignorance and intolerance go hand in hand. They're like commas on a clause. You can't have one without the other. If you take away ignorance, there is no intolerance because we all fear the unknown. You will meet far more people in books than you ever will in your real life. And people from lots of different places that you actually will never go during your life. And you can go in books where you can't go in real life, like the future and the past, that will give you context for a lot of different things. Study after study has shown that people who read more are more tolerant, less opinionated, able to change their mind on things. They're more empathetic. And why is empathy so important? Empathy is the most important human attribute there is. Why? Because it leads to all the other good ones. Without empathy, there could be nothing good about you as a human being. So Should we want leaders of this country who are kind, who care about other people, who are empathetic, who are looking out for others than themselves? I don't think that's too much to ask for leadership in this country. In reading, I grew up with racists in my own family. They were all around me. And I could have grown up with that same perspective, but books saved me. I went to the library every week, and I traveled the world. And I saw people who didn't look like me, pray like me, eat like me, sleep like me, speak like me, learn like me, but at their core, we all shared humanity. So for me, there was no more fear of the unknown. I had met them all in the pages of books in the most vivid way possible. So ignorance for me was gone, and intolerance falls away. That's just the way it works. If you want to have a better society, have a well-read, well-educated society, because what happens then? The more people who are educated, guess what happens? Poverty goes away. Hatred goes away. Homelessness goes away. Crime goes away. Because all those social ills are tied to the lack of people reading, being educated, and understanding the other. And that's what happens in society. The solution is there. All of you can be part of that solution just by reading and encouraging others to read. It used to be when people would come up to me and say, yeah, I know you're a writer. My wife loves you. I haven't read a book since college. And I used to say to them, I get it. Everybody's busy. I don't say that anymore. Not today. Not after the last 10 years in this country. I look at them and they say, I feel so sorry for you. You have no idea the void that you have in your life. And you better do something about that. Come back and join the human race again. Go crack open a book. Learn something about other people who don't look like you. And that brings me to Calamity of Souls. I normally can write a book in 6 months. Calamity of Souls took me 12 years to write because it's so autobiographical. It's set in 1968 in Virginia, and I didn't pick 1968 by happenstance. I picked it because, guess what? There was a presidential election going on. It was going to be close, people thought. The Vietnam War was raging. There were riots all over the country. And people thought 1968 was going to be the end of democracy because it didn't look like the United States was going to be able to survive this. And on top of that, guess what? There was another candidate running for election named George Wallace, who was running on a platform of white supremacy. George Wallace ended up winning 5 states and 10 million votes in 1968 when the population of this country was half of what it is now. It was the most votes ever garnered by a third-party candidate at the time. And the parallels to today, I thought, were stark. So I went back, and after having started this book 12 years ago, going back and looking what I'd written and setting it aside, because I didn't know if I had the wheelhouse. I didn't know if I had the energy to tell this story. But over the last 2 years, I went back and finished it because if I'm not going to do it now, I'm never going to do it. And I think it's still relevant because, quite frankly, you're reading the first few chapters of this novel. If I didn't tell you it was 1968, you would just assume it was 2024. And that says a lot in and of itself. So when you open a book, you're not just seizing an opportunity for entertainment. You're taking measured steps that will enlighten, broaden, and add depth to your humanity. I'm not just saying that. Books were so critical to everything that has happened to me in my life. I can't overstate the importance of it in my life. And it can be the same importance to everyone's lives. Now, after that, we can all take a breath. And I'll finish with a couple of stories. And then if we have time, we can take some questions. I wrote a book in 1998 called The Winner. And in it, my villain Jackson had figured out a way to fix the United States National Lottery. He didn't do it by conspiracy and buying off people. He did it through pure science, which I thought was kind of cool. He didn't need anybody to help him, just through science, chemistry. And I remember my agent, when I sent him the draft, he wrote back and said, I love it, but you've got the prize too high. You got the payout as being $180 million. He said the lottery will never get that high. So when it went to 1.4 billion, I sent him the article about that. And he was like, yeah, I know, you were right about that. So the book came out, big bestseller, people enjoyed it, and I moved on. So like 2 years later, I got a call from a journalist from La Repubblica, Rome's largest daily newspaper. And he said, Mr. Baldacci, have you been following the Italian national lottery scandal? I said, why no, I must have missed that. He goes, well, somebody figured out how to fix the Italian national lottery and did it in a way almost identical to what you wrote about in The Winner. Would you like to comment on that, sir? And I thought about it for a second. I said, well, I have two responses. First is, that's bad, very, very bad. I would never encourage anyone to fix the lottery. That's a crime. Don't do it. My second reaction, that is like the coolest thing anybody's ever told me in my whole life. I am validated. It works, actually. That's great. But please do not read The Winner and go and try to fix the whatever lotto we have around here, because you'll probably go to prison and I'll feel really bad. You'll feel even worse than me, so don't do that. Now, because I'm in Charlottesville, I will end with a story and then we'll take a few questions. People come up to me and say, wow, you're a famous writer. You must get recognized in public all the time. And I'm like, no. Writers are like this anonymous celebrity, if you can sort of imagine that, which I love. I mean, I don't want to be mobbed when I go outside. People may know my name, but they don't look at the picture on the book. It just doesn't happen. But with that said, even when you are recognized in public, it's not the ego stroke you think it might otherwise be. Just not. So I was at a restaurant with my wife in some city. We were in a booth having lunch. And, you know, as you're eating, you kind of look around the space, and I looked around, and the far corner over there, I looked, and there was a man and a woman sitting at a table, and the woman was like laser locked on me, like staring at me, like, I was like, oh my God, you know, that was weird. And so I just looked away, and I was a little freaked out, and I waited, and then I thought, well, you must have totally, misinterpreted that. So I gave it a little bit of time, and I looked back over, laser lock. It was like I had a sniper dot on my forehead. And I just stopped looking. I just eating my meal. And a few minutes went by, and then I sensed the presence next to our table. I looked up, and I thought it was our waitress. It was the woman. So the woman, she pushes me over and sits down next to me in the booth. And with this really weird look on her face, she goes, you are who I think you are, aren't you? Any English teachers want to diagram that sentence? Because there's a lot going on in that sucker. And I had no idea if this woman was insane. I didn't know if she was armed. So I was just trying to keep it sort of calm. And I said, well, do you read a lot of fiction? And she said, oh, yes, I do. Which freaked me out even more. And I said, well, I guess I am who you think I am. And she was like, oh my God. She just lost it. She goes, oh my God. Never in my whole life did I think I would have an opportunity to meet you. This is the most magical moment of my entire life. I can't even process what's happening to me right now. And then she turns and she screams all the way across, I guess, to her husband. She was like, I was right, Joe. It is John Grisham. So I've known John for 25 years. John's a great guy. Every time I've asked him to do an event up here or down in Florida, wherever, he's always stepped up. Love him. He's a classic Southern gentleman. But quite frankly, I have to tell you that that moment in my life, I was not feeling the love for John. And my poor wife, to put it delicately, she blew iced tea out of her nose. Like, and was laughing hysterically for like 3 minutes. I couldn't stop her from laughing. I just couldn't. I just stared at her and horrified. And then she finally calmed down, and she said to the woman really, very diplomatically, she goes, that's the right genre, but the wrong author. And the woman looked mortified. And she's like, oh my God. She goes, are you Baldacci? And I said, yeah, I am. And so obviously terribly chagrined that I was not Monsieur Grisham, this lady turns and screams across this crowded restaurant to her husband and said, you're right, Joe. It is the Italian. Thank you very much.